The demolition crew was already unloading their equipment when I walked out onto my deck that morning. Corinne Mitchell stood there with her arms crossed, a satisfied smirk spreading across her face as she watched the bulldozers position themselves in front of my cabin. This was the home I had spent 2 years of my life rebuilding with my own hands. This was my grandfather's legacy, my dream retirement, my everything. "I hope you learned your lesson about challenging the HOA," she called out to me, her voice dripping with victory. "Maybe next time you will think twice before ignoring our regulations." I stood there in my pajamas, watching everything I had worked for about to be destroyed. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding, but something strange was happening in my mind. All those sleepless nights researching property records had finally clicked into place. That is when I realized Corinne Mitchell and her entire HOA board had been operating illegally on my land for 15 years. 2 years ago, I inherited the most beautiful piece of property you could imagine. My grandfather had left me 47 acres of pristine mountain land in Colorado, complete with a rustic log cabin that overlooked the valley below. The cabin was old, probably built in the 1960s, but it had good bones and an incredible view. I remember the first time I walked onto that property after the funeral. The morning mist was rising from the pine trees, and you could see for miles across the mountains. I stood on that old wooden deck, drinking coffee from a thermos, and I knew this was where I wanted to spend the rest of my life. I had been working in Chicago for 23 years, grinding away in corporate finance, saving every penny I could for retirement. When I inherited the cabin, it felt like a sign from the universe. This was my chance to escape the city noise, the traffic, the stress of modern life. So I made the biggest decision of my life. I took early retirement, cashed out my 401k, and moved to Colorado full-time. I was going to restore this cabin and make it my permanent home. The renovation work was brutal but incredibly rewarding. I spent months learning carpentry, plumbing, and electrical work through YouTube videos. I rebuilt the stone fireplace by hand, restored the original hardwood floors, and upgraded the entire kitchen. Every nail I hammered, every board I sanded, every pipe I connected was done with love and pride. When I first moved to the Mountain Vista community, everyone seemed friendly enough. The Mountain Vista Homeowners Association had been running the neighborhood for about 15 years, managing the common areas, organizing community events, and maintaining the roads. The HOA president was a woman named Corinne Mitchell. She lived in one of the newer houses near the entrance to the community. When I first met her, she seemed pleasant enough. She welcomed me to the neighborhood, gave me a copy of the HOA bylaws, and told me how happy she was to have a new permanent resident. I did everything by the book. I applied for all the necessary building permits through the county. I submitted my renovation plans to the HOA Architectural Committee for approval. I paid my dues on time every month. I even volunteered to help with the annual community barbecue. But over the first year, I started noticing things about Corinne that made me uncomfortable. She had this way of talking to people that made it clear she expected total obedience. During HOA meetings, she would shut down any discussion that challenged her decisions. She had this cold, calculating way of looking at you when you disagreed with her. I watched her target other homeowners over minor infractions. Mrs. Garcia got a violation notice because her garden shed was 6 inches too close to her property line. The Johnson family was fined because their Christmas lights stayed up 3 days past the HOA deadline. Every violation came with threats of escalating fines and legal action. By the end of my first year, I had invested my entire life savings into this cabin renovation. This was not just my home anymore. This was my financial future, my retirement plan, my legacy. I had put everything I had into making this place perfect. I should have seen the warning signs. I should have realized that Corinne Mitchell was not the type of person who liked independent homeowners, who did not need her approval for everything. I should have known that my peaceful mountain retreat was about to become a battlefield. The violation notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in October. I was drinking my coffee on the deck, watching the aspen trees turn golden in the early sunlight, when I heard the mail truck pull up to my mailbox. I walked down the gravel driveway in my slippers, expecting the usual bills and catalogs. Instead, I found a certified letter from the Mountain Vista Homeowners Association. The return address alone made my stomach clench. I tore open the envelope right there at the mailbox. The official letterhead at the top read, "Notice of violation, immediate action required." My hand started shaking as I read the first paragraph. "Dear Mr. Thompson, it has come to the attention of the Mountain Vista HOA Board that your cabin structure violates Section 4.7 of the 1987 Architectural Covenant regarding rustic log construction standards. This violation was recently discovered during a comprehensive review of all properties within the community." My vision went blurry for a moment. I had to read that sentence 3 times before it sank in. They were claiming my cabin violated some regulation from 1987, but my cabin had been approved by every HOA board for decades. My grandfather had lived here peacefully for 20 years before he died. I kept reading, and each sentence felt like a physical blow to my chest. "You have 48 hours from receipt of this notice to begin demolition of the non-compliant structure. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $500 per day, escalating legal action, and potential forced removal at your expense." 48 hours. They wanted me to demolish my home in 48 hours. I ran back to the cabin, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might have a heart attack. I immediately called the HOA office, but got a recording saying they were closed until the following day. I spent the rest of that day digging through every document I had about the property. I found my building permits, all approved. I found the HOA Architectural Committee approval from when I started renovations, signed by Corinne Mitchell herself. I found letters from previous HOA boards welcoming my grandfather to the community. Everything was legal, everything was documented, everything was approved. The next morning, I drove straight to the HOA office. Corinne Mitchell was sitting behind her desk, looking completely calm and professional. She smiled at me like we were old friends. "Hello, Mr. Thompson. I assume you are here about the violation notice." "Corinne, there has to be some mistake," I said, spreading all my documents across her desk. "Look, I have approval for everything. My cabin has been here for decades." She barely glanced at the paperwork before pushing it back toward me. "I am sorry, but the violation stands. We recently discovered that Section 4.7 of the original 1987 covenant was never properly enforced. Your cabin does not meet the architectural standards, and we have no choice but to require compliance." "But you approved my renovations yourself," I said, holding up her signature. "How can you approve work on a cabin that violates the covenants?" Her smile turned cold. That approval was for interior renovations only. The exterior structure itself has always been non-compliant. Perhaps you should have researched more thoroughly before investing so much money in an illegal structure. I felt my face burning with anger and disbelief. "Corinne, this is insane. You cannot just destroy someone's home because of some technicality from 35 years ago. Appeals are unfortunately impossible in cases of clear covenant violations, she said, standing up to signal the meeting was over. I suggest you contact a moving company. You have 36 hours remaining. I walked out of that office in a complete daze. As I sat in my truck in the parking lot, trying to process what had just happened, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Corinne Mitchell was on her phone, and through the window I could see her pointing toward the mountain where my cabin sat. She was talking to someone about my property, and she was smiling. That was when I realized this was not about architectural covenants. This was personal, and I was about to lose everything I had worked for to a woman who seemed to enjoy destroying people's lives. That night I did not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by legal documents, property records, and HOA bylaws, trying to find some way to save my home. The demolition deadline was ticking away like a bomb, and I was running out of time. I called every lawyer in the county the next morning. Most of them would not even take my call once they heard it was an HOA dispute. The few who did talk to me quoted fees that would bankrupt me even if I won. Finally, I found a lawyer named David Chen who specialized in property law. He agreed to meet with me that afternoon, and for the first time in 2 days, I felt a spark of hope. David reviewed all my documents while I sat across from his desk, my leg bouncing with nervous energy. He nodded thoughtfully as he read through the paperwork, occasionally making notes on his legal pad. "This is definitely unusual," he said after an hour of review. "The timing is suspicious, and their interpretation of the covenant seems aggressive. But I have to be honest with you, Mr. Thompson. HOA disputes are incredibly expensive to fight, and they rarely end well for individual homeowners." "What are you saying?" I asked. "I am saying that even if we file an emergency injunction and manage to stop the demolition, you are looking at months or years of legal battles. The HOA has deep pockets and institutional support. You will be fighting this alone." My heart sank, but I pressed on. "How much will it cost?" "Probably $50,000 to $75,000 minimum, and that is assuming we win quickly." I felt like I was drowning. That was more money than I had left after the cabin renovation. But what choice did I have? "Do it," I said. "File whatever you need to file." David immediately got to work on an emergency injunction, while I drove home to gather more documentation. But as I was searching through my grandfather's old papers, I made a discovery that filled me with rage. I found a folder labeled HOA Complaints Other Homeowners. Inside were photocopies of violation notices sent to at least 6 other families over the past 2 years. All of them had been forced to sell their properties at below-market prices rather than fight expensive legal battles. Mrs. Garcia, who got fined for her garden shed, had sold her house for $30,000 less than market value. The Johnson family, with their Christmas light violation, had been forced into bankruptcy and lost their home entirely. Corinne Mitchell was not just targeting me. She was systematically destroying families and forcing them out of the community. But why? I started making phone calls to the families who had been forced out. Most of them were too scared or too broken to talk, but Mrs. Garcia finally agreed to meet with me. She wanted our property, Mrs. Garcia told me over coffee at a diner in town. My husband overheard her talking to some developer about expanding the community clubhouse. Our lot was perfect for the expansion, but we would not sell voluntarily. So she forced you out with fake violations. The violations were not fake, she said sadly. They were just incredibly petty interpretations of rules that no one had ever enforced before. She knew we could not afford to fight her legally, so we had no choice but to sell. I drove home that evening with a sick feeling in my stomach. Corinne Mitchell was running a systematic scheme to force out homeowners she did not like or whose property she wanted, and I was just the latest victim. The legal bills started piling up immediately. David filed the emergency injunction, but the court would not hear our case for another week. Meanwhile, Corinne was spreading rumors about me throughout the community, telling everyone that I was a troublemaker who refused to follow the rules. Some neighbors stopped talking to me entirely. Others looked at me with pity, like I was already defeated. The isolation was almost as crushing as the financial pressure. After 2 weeks of legal maneuvering, David called me with devastating news. "I am sorry, Mr. Thompson, but I do not think we can win this case. The judge is very conservative about property rights, and the HOA has excellent legal representation. My recommendation is that you consider settling before your legal bills get any higher." I hung up the phone and sat in my empty cabin, surrounded by all the work I had done with my own hands. In less than 10 hours, the demolition crew would arrive. I had spent $15,000 on legal fees and got nowhere. I was completely alone, completely broke, and completely defeated, or so I thought. I was sitting on my front porch at 2 in the morning, watching the stars and trying to accept that I was about to lose everything. The demolition was scheduled for 8 a.m. I had maybe 6 hours left in my home. I was thinking about calling my sister in Denver, asking if I could sleep on her couch while I figured out what to do with the rest of my life. I was thinking about how I would explain to everyone that I had lost my retirement, my savings, and my dream to an HOA president with a power complex. That was when I saw Mrs. Peterson walking her dog. Mrs. Peterson was 84 years old and had lived in the community longer than anyone else. She was one of the original residents, back when this was just a few scattered cabins in the woods before the HOA was even formed. "Evening, dear," she said as she approached my porch. "I heard about your troubles with the association. Such a shame what Corinne is doing to you." "I am sorry you have to see this, Mrs. Peterson," I said. "I know it will be a mess when they tear it down." She shook her head sadly. "Your grandfather would be rolling over in his grave if he knew what was happening. He was so proud of this place." "You knew my grandfather?" "Oh yes, Harold and I were good friends. He was here long before any HOA nonsense. In fact, I always thought it was strange how they formed that association on his land without ever asking his permission." Something in her words made me sit up straighter. "What do you mean, on his land?" "Well, dear, when your grandfather first bought this property back in the 70s, it was much larger than what people think. He owned all the common areas that the HOA manages now. The clubhouse, the pool, the tennis courts, even the main entrance road. It was all part of his original purchase." My heart started pounding. "Mrs. Peterson, are you sure about that?" "Of course I am sure. I was here when he bought it. 47 acres it was, running from the main road all the way up to the ridge line. The HOA carved out their common areas from his property when they formed the association." I stood up so fast I almost knocked over my coffee cup. "Do you know if there are any records of that sale? Did my grandfather sell them the land for the common areas?" She looked puzzled. "Sell it? Dear, I do not think Harold ever sold them anything. The association just formed one day and started managing those areas. I always assumed they had worked out some kind of agreement with him." I was already moving toward my front door. Mrs. Peterson, thank you. You might have just saved my life. I spent the rest of the night in my grandfather's study, going through every single document he had kept about the property. I found the original deed from 1974, when he purchased the land from a logging company. The legal description was clear: 47 acres, including all the areas that the HOA now claimed to own. I found correspondence between my grandfather and the early HOA organizers. They had asked for permission to use his land for community facilities, and he had agreed to let them build a small clubhouse and pool area. But there was no record of any sale, no deed transfer, no payment. As the sun came up, I was digging through county property records online. What I found made my hands shake with excitement and rage. The Mountain Vista Homeowners Association had been operating on my property for 15 years without any legal ownership. They had built their clubhouse, their pool, their tennis courts, and their fancy entrance gate on land that legally belonged to me. They had been collecting dues and fees from homeowners to maintain facilities on my private property. And Corinne Mitchell knew this. She had to know this. That was why she was so desperate to force me out. If I ever discovered the truth about the property ownership, her entire kingdom would crumble. I grabbed my phone and called David Chen, even though it was only 6 in the morning. David, I need you to file an emergency motion to stop the demolition. I have evidence that the HOA does not own the land they claim to own. What are you talking about? He said, still groggy from sleep. I am talking about 15 years of illegal operations on my private property. I am talking about thousands of dollars in unauthorized improvements made on my land. I am talking about fraud, trespassing, and unjust enrichment. There was a long pause. Send me everything you have right now. As I was scanning documents and sending them to David, I heard the rumble of heavy equipment coming up the mountain road. The demolition crew was arriving early, probably at Corinne's request to make sure I could not find any last-minute legal loopholes. But this time I was not panicked. This time I was not afraid. This time I was holding all the cards. I walked out onto my deck and watched as Corinne Mitchell climbed out of her SUV, followed by several HOA board members and what looked like a local news reporter. She had planned this as a public spectacle, a warning to other homeowners about what happened when you challenged her authority. She had no idea she was about to become the victim of her own show. I decided to let Corinne Mitchell have her moment of triumph. I needed her to feel completely confident, totally in control, before I destroyed her. I walked out to meet the demolition crew wearing my oldest clothes and carrying a single cardboard box, playing the part of the defeated homeowner perfectly. Corinne was standing near the bulldozers with her arms crossed, surrounded by 3 other HOA board members and a reporter from the local newspaper. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she called out, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I hope you have had time to remove your belongings. The demolition will begin in 30 minutes. I set my cardboard box down and looked around at all the people gathered to witness my humiliation. "Corinne, I know I do not have any legal standing here, but could I possibly have just one more day? I have not been able to find anywhere to put my grandfather's furniture." She shook her head with exaggerated sympathy. "I am sorry, but the violation has already been extended far beyond what our covenants allow. The demolition must proceed as scheduled." "I understand," I said, letting my voice crack slightly. "I just want everyone to know that I tried to follow all the rules. I never meant to cause any problems for the community." Corinne stepped closer, clearly enjoying every moment of this. "Mr. Thompson, I want you and everyone else in this community to understand something very important. The covenants and restrictions that govern Mountain Vista exist for a reason. They protect our property values and maintain the character of our neighborhood. She turned to address the small crowd that had gathered. When residents think they can ignore our architectural standards, when they think the rules do not apply to them, this is what happens. The HOA board has a responsibility to enforce compliance, even when it is difficult. The reporter was taking notes, and I could see some of my neighbors watching from their windows. This was exactly what Corinne wanted, a public execution to send a message about her power. I hope everyone learns from Mr. Thompson's mistake, she continued. When you challenge the HOA, when you think you know better than the board, you will lose, every single time. I nodded sadly and picked up my cardboard box. You are absolutely right, Corinne. I should have done more research before I invested everything in this property. That was when I reached into the box and pulled out the original 1974 property deed. In fact, I have been doing research all night, I said, my voice suddenly steady and strong, and I discovered something very interesting about this property. Corinne's smile faltered slightly. Mr. Thompson, whatever you think you have found, it does not change the fact that your cabin violates our covenants. Actually, Corinne, it changes everything. I held up the deed so everyone could see it. This is the original property deed from when my grandfather purchased this land in 1974. It clearly shows that he bought 47 acres, including all the areas that your HOA claims to own. The reporter looked up from his notepad, suddenly interested. The board members glanced at each other nervously. That is ridiculous, Corinne said, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. The HOA has owned and operated the common areas for 15 years. No, Corinne. The HOA has been operating on my private property for 15 years without legal ownership. I pulled out a stack of county records. I spent the night reviewing property transfers, and there is no record of my grandfather ever selling this land to the HOA. I walked over to the clubhouse and pointed at the building. This clubhouse was built on my property without my permission. Your pool, your tennis courts, your fancy entrance gate, all of it is on my private land. The crowd was murmuring now, and I could see confusion and concern on the faces of the board members. But Corinne was not backing down. Even if that were true, which it is not, it would not change anything about your cabin violation, she said desperately. Actually, it changes everything, I said, pulling out my phone. Because 15 minutes ago, my lawyer filed emergency motions with the county court. I am now demanding immediate eviction of all unauthorized structures on my property, plus 15 years of back rent for the illegal use of my land. The silence was deafening. Corinne's face had gone completely white. Furthermore, I continued, I am calculating rental fees for the common areas based on current market rates. The clubhouse alone sits on about 2 acres of prime mountain property. At current commercial rental rates, that works out to approximately $8,000 per month. I did some quick math in my head. 15 years times $8,000 per month, plus the pool area, plus the tennis courts, plus the entrance improvements. We are looking at approximately $1.4 million in back rent. The demolition crew supervisor approached me. Sir, should we proceed with the demolition? No, I said firmly. This demolition is canceled. Any unauthorized destruction of structures on my private property will result in additional legal action. I turned back to Corinne, who was standing there like she had been struck by lightning. So here is what is going to happen, Corinne. You are going to cancel this demolition immediately. You are going to call an emergency HOA board meeting to discuss my rental terms for continued use of my property. And you are going to stop harassing homeowners with fake violations. This is impossible, she whispered. The HOA owns this land. We have owned it for 15 years. Prove it, I said simply. Show me the deed. Show me the purchase agreement. Show me any legal document that transfers ownership of this land from my grandfather to your HOA. She could not, because those documents did not exist. I had just turned the tables completely. The woman who tried to destroy my home had just discovered that I owned her entire kingdom. Within 2 hours of my revelation, word had spread throughout the entire Mountain Vista community. My phone was ringing constantly with calls from neighbors, reporters, and legal professionals who had heard about the property ownership dispute. David Chen arrived at the property by noon, carrying a briefcase full of legal documents and wearing the biggest smile I had ever seen on a lawyer's face. This is the most beautiful case of adverse possession and property fraud I have encountered in 20 years of practice, he told me as we walked around the clubhouse grounds. The HOA has made millions of dollars in improvements on your land without any legal right to do so. What does that mean for me? I asked. It means you now own a clubhouse, a pool, tennis courts, and landscaping worth approximately $2 million, and you can charge the HOA whatever you want in rent for continued use of your property. That afternoon, I formally served the Mountain Vista HOA board with eviction notices and a demand for back rent totaling $1.6 million. I also filed liens against all the common area improvements as compensation for 15 years of unauthorized use of my property. Corinne Mitchell called an emergency HOA board meeting for that evening. I was not invited, but I did not need to be. I owned the building where they were meeting. Around 8 p.m., Corinne showed up at my front door with 2 other board members. She looked like she had aged 10 years in a single day. Mr. Thompson, we need to discuss this situation, she said, trying to maintain some dignity. Surely we can work out some reasonable arrangement. I am listening, I said. The HOA is willing to acknowledge that there may have been some confusion about the property boundaries. We would be happy to pay a modest rental fee for use of the common areas going forward. I pulled out a sheet of paper with my calculated rental rates. Based on current commercial property values, I am asking for $12,000 per month for the clubhouse and pool area, plus $5,000 per month for the tennis courts and entrance facilities. Corinne's face went pale. $17,000 per month. That is impossible. It would triple our operating costs overnight. That is the current market rate for commercial rental of this type of property, I said calmly. Of course, you are free to relocate your facilities to land that you actually own. But the homeowners will never agree to pay increased dues that high, one of the other board members said. It would bankrupt the association. Then I suggest you find a more affordable location for your operations, I replied. I am not running a charity here. Corinne tried one more desperate approach. What about all the homeowners who will be affected by this? Their property values will plummet if the HOA dissolves. You will be hurting innocent families. I am glad you brought that up, I said, pulling out another folder. Because I have been researching the families you forced out of this community over the past 2 years. Mrs. Garcia, the Johnson family, the Williams couple. All of them lost their homes because of your fake violations and harassment. I handed her a list of names. I am planning to use the rental income from your facilities to establish a fund that will compensate those families for their losses. Unlike you, I actually care about the people in this community." The meeting ended with the board members leaving in stunned silence. But the real satisfaction came over the next few days as word spread about what had happened. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the David versus Goliath property dispute. Within a week, I was getting calls from reporters across the state who wanted to interview me about standing up to HOA abuse. More importantly, I started hearing from other homeowners who had been victims of Corinne's harassment. People began coming forward with their own stories of petty violations, excessive fines, and intimidation tactics. Corinne Mitchell tried to rally support from the remaining board members and homeowners, but her credibility was completely destroyed. When people realized that she had been operating illegally for 15 years, collecting dues and fees for facilities she did not own, the outrage was overwhelming. 2 weeks after the failed demolition, Corinne resigned from the HOA board in disgrace. 1 week after that, she put her house up for sale and moved out of the community entirely. The new HOA board, led by reasonable people who actually cared about the community, negotiated a fair rental agreement with me for continued use of the common areas. The monthly fees were reasonable, and I agreed to use most of the rental income to improve the facilities and compensate Corinne's previous victims. Mrs. Garcia received a check for $35,000 to compensate for the below-market sale of her home. The Johnson family received enough money to pay off the debts that had forced them into bankruptcy. But the sweetest justice of all came when I received a call from a reporter who had been investigating HOA abuse across the state. "Mr. Thompson, we have discovered that Corinne Mitchell was running similar schemes in 2 other communities before she came to Mountain Vista. Your case has opened up a much larger investigation into systematic HOA fraud." Corinne's reign of terror was not just ending in my community, it was ending everywhere. 6 months later, I am sitting on my deck with my morning coffee, watching the sunrise paint the mountain peaks golden. The same view that almost got destroyed by a power-hungry HOA president who thought she could bully me into submission. The Mountain Vista community has been completely transformed. The new HOA board, elected by homeowners who were fed up with corruption and abuse, operates with complete transparency and fairness. Every decision is made with input from the community, and no one lives in fear of arbitrary violations anymore. My cabin, the home that Corinne Mitchell tried to demolish, has become something of a landmark in the community. People drive by just to see the place where one homeowner stood up to systemic abuse, and won. I have had visitors from across the country who want to hear the story in person and learn how to research their own property rights. The rental income from the HOA facilities has allowed me to make improvements that benefit everyone. We upgraded the pool with new heating systems, renovated the clubhouse with modern meeting facilities, and added hiking trails throughout the common areas. Instead of using the land to generate personal profit, I decided to reinvest everything back into the community. But the most satisfying part of this entire experience has been helping other homeowners who were victims of Corinne's abuse. Mrs. Garcia used her compensation money to buy a beautiful new home in a community with fair HOA management. The Johnson family was able to rebuild their credit and purchase another home. Every family that was forced out because of fake violations has been made whole. The investigation into Corinne Mitchell's activities has expanded far beyond Mountain Vista. Law enforcement discovered that she had been running similar schemes in communities across 3 different states, always targeting vulnerable homeowners who could not afford expensive legal battles. She is currently facing multiple felony charges for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. Her method was always the same: identify homeowners with valuable property, find obscure violations in decades-old covenants, and force them to sell at below-market prices to avoid costly legal fights. But her biggest mistake was targeting someone who had the time, resources, and determination to fight back completely. She thought I would be another easy victim who would fold under pressure. Instead, she picked a fight with someone who discovered that she had been operating her entire scam on my private property. The legal resolution of my case has inspired homeowners across the country to research their own property rights. I receive emails every week from people who have discovered similar problems with their HOAs, and many of them have successfully challenged illegal operations in their own communities. My story has been featured on national news programs, in property rights publications, and even in a documentary about HOA abuse. But I did not do this for fame or recognition. I did it because someone needed to stand up to a system that was destroying innocent families. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that bullies only have power when people are too afraid or too isolated to fight back. Karen Mitchell was able to terrorize homeowners for years because each victim thought they were alone. But when people stand together and refuse to accept abuse, even the most powerful bullies can be defeated. I also learned the critical importance of understanding your property rights. Most homeowners never bother to read their deeds or research the history of their land. They assume that HOAs and local authorities have legitimate power over their property. But sometimes, the people claiming authority have no legal right to exercise that power at all. Today, Mountain Vista is a community where families can enjoy their homes without fear of harassment or arbitrary punishment. Children play in the pool that was built on my property, but which now serves everyone fairly. Adults use the clubhouse for community meetings where every voice is heard and respected. As I finish my coffee and prepare to start another day in the home that almost got demolished, I think about my grandfather and how proud he would be. This land has been in our family for 50 years, and it will remain in our family for generations to come. Karen Mitchell tried to destroy my dreams, but instead she gave me the opportunity to build something much better. A community based on fairness, transparency, and mutual respect, rather than fear and control. Sometimes the best revenge is not getting even. Sometimes the best revenge is building something beautiful from the ashes of what someone tried to destroy.